You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your wild host, Abraham.
And I am your rabid host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast, and we like to talk about all of the things related to human and animal psychology and other things that maybe are a little bit tangential to those topics.
Yeah, I mean, for anybody who's ever taken an abnormal psychology class, we try to cover that stuff too every now and again. And there's always some interesting case studies that come up and unique human experiences that are worth talking about. And today we are going to talk about one of those things that happens in the animal kingdom, and that is going feral.
Yeah, and what that means and all of that, which is cool. I think it's fun to unpack these types of topics. So if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. If you enjoy what you hear today, if you would like to make sure that you always get every episode and make sure that you get to learn all the content we have to offer, you should subscribe. Potentially join us on Patreon. You can leave us a rating and review. All of those things help us. You can pick up some merch.
You could also donate to your local zoo and get a plaque for some animal enclosure, your favorite animal. Maybe it's a penguin, maybe it's a zebra, whatever it is, and put our name on it instead.
There you go. That's a great way. And I'll talk more about how you can support us at the end of this discussion today. But as you said, we are talking about animals. And speaking of animals, this episode comes out on February 15th, which I did not know, but that is World Hippo Day.
Oh, yes, those murderous river cows.
Yeah.
Super happy to celebrate them. It's also Singles Awareness Day, not Shingles Awareness Day. Very different holiday. Although it can feel the same, I guess, for some folks.
I was reading up on this because I was kind of curious what that meant, what it implied. It has to do with the fact that this episode will come out just right around Valentine's Day, which, speaking of which, happy Valentine's Day, everybody.
Yeah.
Hope it went really well for you.
Sure.
And there are a lot of people who are not in relationships and get the question like, when are you going to find a boyfriend or a girlfriend or get married or whatever? And so just recognizing that some people either by choice or not are single and they're doing fine.
Yeah. They're not particularly interested in mingling.
Yeah. Or like they're just not there yet. Like they'll be there, whatever.
Yeah.
Point being, there are lots of other things to talk about. It's also Gumdrop Day. So if you're into gumdrops.
Yeah. I mean, dots are cool, I guess. It's also International Flirting Week, so, ooh la la, I guess.
That tracks. Seems related to Singles Day and Valentine's Day and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The month history, there's 2 month things to talk about. One we have already talked about, and we're just going to say it again because it's worth talking about. But the one that we haven't mentioned yet, I don't think, is that it is Bake for Family Fun Month, which is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It is promoting the idea that you get in the kitchen with your family and make some sweet treats.
I love that. We've been doing that at the house for the last couple of weeks, and it's been a blast.
Nice.
It's also Black History Month. Yeah. So please, please, please read up, acknowledge some things, and do some good.
There you go. So that's why we mention Black History Month again, is because it's important.
Yes.
Okay. We have a bit of an intro for this topic. So we're talking about animals, and as you said, when they go feral and what that means. And so we're going to unpack this. We're going to do so as clearly as we can because there's some interesting implications of the idea of what it means to be wild, what it means to be feral. But let's start with the fact that cats, like domestic cats, kill 1.3 to 1.4 billion birds every year. That is a lot of birds.
Assuming you believe birds are real.
Assuming you believe that they're real. That maybe they're taking down drones, but they kill 1.3 to 1.4 billion of them a year, which is a lot. And almost 70% of the cats that are doing this, of those bird killing perpetrators, are feral cats specifically.
Super interesting stuff.
So almost all of them.
Almost all of them. Now, Texas reports a significant feral pig problem. No, not Congress or anything like that. Actual pigs, with pigs occupying all but one county in Texas. And these are not native to the land, but as opportunistic feeders, they consume any type of, usually plant matter, any type of food that they can find. They also root around in the dirt, which tills up the soil in the area. They especially area people do not want tilled. Like they want to keep those areas untilled.
Right.
And they love to bathe, which results in higher than expected fecal matter and urine content in lakes, ponds, streams, and rivers. So pigs are a real problem in Texas for so many reasons.
Yeah, or at least they think so. And we'll dig into that. All right. Now, to deal with feral or invasive populations, people will engage in this systematic culling. And what that really does, we'll unpack this a little bit more, but it mostly eliminates competition for resources from the survivors of that culling, who then go on to have so many more babies that they basically replenish the population. Meaning that if people were to kill, let's just say, for example, 50% of the pigs to reduce the quote unquote damage caused by the pigs, that means that the 50% of pigs who are left that they didn't kill, they now have less competition for food and shelter, and they basically just go into full-on breed mode, and they breed up back to the maximum population that they kind of can.
Yeah, not super helpful and just kind of violent. So we are going to ask the question, what does feral mean? Is it a problem? And if so, what can be done about it? That's really the ultimate goal of this episode.
Yes. So feral, from Latin fera, meaning wild, or fera bestia, or bestia, meaning wild beast. Feral is sometimes used to simply describe undomesticated animals, but it's actually most often used to refer to animals that descend from domesticated animals but are now wild. So for example, if you were to have, let's say you had a ranch that had some cattle on it, and for whatever reason that ranch shut down or was abandoned or the cattle got out, whatever happened, and they went out into the world and they just had babies, and those babies just grew up in the wild, we might describe those as being feral because they came from domesticated animals. And that might be true also of dogs, like they're someone's pet dogs, they get out, or the people die, or whatever happens, those dogs go out into the wild, they have babies, their babies are raised in the wild, and they continue to go on and breed, and those came from a domesticated stock of animals. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And when people reference feral animals, they typically reference feral cats. You'll hear that most often.
Yeah, it's a lot.
But you'll also hear feral dogs, pigs, goats, rabbits, horses, camels. I mean, and even people. Like, there are lots of examples of why, like, how people use the term feral to describe a particular organism in a circumstance where they have kind of, quote unquote, become uncivilized.
It might be worth distinguishing the fact that feral does not mean rabid. Rabid typically refers to, I think in technical speech and most other speech, refers to animals that have rabies specifically.
Sure.
But I think people might, I feel like I've heard people sort of refer to a feral animal as being rabid just instead of calling it feral, which is not technically correct. We're not talking about rabid or rabies animals. We're just talking about the ones that are out in the wild. And for technical consistency, we're only referring to animals that were once domesticated and have become feral or wild, not ones that are normally wild. And that includes the animal of human.
Yes, absolutely. So now that we've got a kind of a basis for what feral means, it's worth talking about why this has come up as a quote unquote problem. You'll hear kind of people describe feral animals as being a problem, like we saw in the Texas example, but that might not be the case. So when we kind of unpack this, I think you'll find that it's actually maybe a kind of a good thing.
And we'll start with where it can be problematic. As we said, a lot of times feral animals are just their escaped pets. They got out of people's homes for whatever reason. Or there also could be animals that hitched a ride with humans aboard things like ships, planes, imported goods, and sometimes on the clothes we're wearing. So for whatever reason, these small creatures, that sort of thing, can get into a place they're not supposed to be.
Right. And sometimes they immediately die off in an environment which they are ill-suited for. So they maybe don't know what their food sources are. Maybe the environment just simply won't work for them. And sometimes they're completely harmless additions to an existing ecosystem. So there's really, it could go either way depending on the species and the climate and the environment and the food resources that are available in those areas.
Now, the problem as it relates to ferals usually lies in two things. One is that feral animals can be an annoyance to humans and the systems that humans create to navigate the world.
Sure.
And two is when they outcompete significant proportions of an existing ecosystem, and they completely radically change the nature of that ecosystem because they are such powerful competitors added to that new ecosystem.
Right. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the issue of B, this outcompeting issue. Several animals, when they go quote unquote feral, they come from an evolutionary history and circumstances that were much harsher than the new environment. in which they find themselves, and thus they are extremely competitive, sometimes laughably so, with their new roommates, and it causes a little bit of a ruckus. So let's talk about these pythons in Florida, because people need more reasons not to come here.
Yes. One of the things that I found cited frequently was the python problem in Florida. And these are Burmese pythons, and they have been enormously successful in Florida.
Yes.
And it's partially because Florida contains some of the most favorable conditions of the Burmese python's original habitat, where they come from in Southeastern Asia. Except that in Florida, they have even more food, even less competition, even better weather, and even fewer predators. So they are really fit to thrive in this system.
Yeah, the Everglades are like perfect for these things.
Yes.
It's the episode of The Simpsons. It's Whacking Day. Like there's like a whole season where like people go out and have to hunt them because there are so many. Now, Burmese pythons already had very few predators, some large cats, some birds of prey. And in Florida, they really only have alligators and people. And arguably the alligators are far more competent.
Yeah.
In addition to that, they have what must feel like to them an endless buffet of the best food.
Yeah.
Their prey in Florida have not evolved to deal with predators such as the python, and they are not evolving quickly enough to avoid extinction from this new predator. So you're kind of in this space where it's like free reign.
Yeah.
It's vacation. It's them going on a cruise and being able to eat whatever they want, whenever they want, at all times of the day. It's fantastic for them.
Yeah, it really is. And so there's a ton of food around, and it doesn't try very hard to get away from them. And they're like, they barely have to hunt.
Yeah.
They're like, cool, we'll do this. And they're used to dealing with situations where they get very cold, where they have to hibernate a little bit in their original habitats. They evolved to have to go for weeks and months without food if needed. They have an endless supply of food and mostly warm weather.
Yeah.
Or at least it doesn't get so cold that they need to hibernate very often.
Nope.
A lot of the time. So yeah, Florida is a very comfortable haven for these pythons. And so they have bred and survived tremendously. And I had a hard time finding exactly how it was that they came to be a feral invasive species in Florida. And there was two things. Well, there's a couple of suggestions that people had. One is that they can grow very large given the space to do so. And so what some people speculate happened is that some people who got exotic pets that were these Burmese pythons, they became too overwhelmed by trying to take care of them. And rather than kill them, they just let them go in the wild, and they were really successful. But some more people think that probably the more likely situation is that there are a lot of people who had these exotic pets. So both scenarios are true. People got into these exotic pets. A lot of them were brought to the United States, whether people let them go out of negligence or being overwhelmed or whatever. What people think probably happened is when a hurricane came through, some houses were flooded, the infrastructure that was holding the snakes were damaged, and a lot of them escaped that way. And that would make sense for how they were able to, there were so many more of them to breed, that's how they were able to breed so quickly and take over so rapidly.
Yeah. I mean, but besides the fact there are a lot of snake people in Florida, it's very possible that a hurricane it's always a disaster here. So welcome to Florida, or if you're afraid of alligators and sharks, now we have snakes too.
Indeed. So snakes aren't your bag. Do not go into the Everglades.
Yeah. I mean, don't go into the Everglades anyway, but the snakes don't help.
But how do snakes compare to cats? You'll have to listen to these ads to find out.
All right, and we're back. We have left the snakes in the dust, and we are going to talk about cats. So, when a feral cat enters an ecosystem, they will enter at a nearly dominant position in the food chain. Cats are one of the most efficient predators on Earth, and they have evolved in a highly specialized manner, specifically a set of characteristics for stalking and killing anything smaller than them. They are quiet, they are patient, they are agile, fast, clever, and extremely aggressive, and they will mow down rodent after rodent and bird after bird, entire populations of these things to near extinction if given the opportunity to do so. Cats are highly specialized killers in the animal world.
I have seen a statistic that they are actually the most effective. So for every time that they attack prey, they're more successful than any other animal on Earth. Is one statistic that I found. There are probably some that are close or maybe even overtake them in some instances, but they are highly evolved to be hunters. That is what they do. Now, of course, most domesticated cats are fairly small, so they just avoid larger animals, and thus they mostly avoid predation, and thus they mostly avoid humans. So they tend to actually not usually be viewed as pests from a human perspective, except when they kill other animals that humans also love, like people's birds or other small pets that they might have, like rabbits.
Now, other plants, animals, insects, reptiles, birds, and fish have similar stories. Once they enter a low competition environment, they can come to quickly alter the dynamics of that system. Whether it's an issue of predation or disease, of competition, destruction of the habitat, something can happen and a species can entirely take over. I mean, if you look at the policies, there's In a Sunburnt Country by Bill Bryson. Specifically, he talks about how in Australia, they have really, really strict guidelines on bringing animals into, whether feral or not, bringing animals into Australia because the ecosystem can be so delicate. So, and when you bring something that has no competition, which I mean, arguably everything in Australia is competition.
Yeah.
But if you bring something in without competition, it's very likely, it's very possible that it can overrun that ecosystem pretty quickly.
Yeah. And even plants can become these feral sort of invasive species. They can destroy native species of food that humans and other wildlife depend on by essentially just outcompeting them in that environment. Feral animals can alter the water such that other native species die off and the water becomes less usable to humans, as we talked about with the pigs.
Huh?
And essentially, rather than join or contribute to a thriving ecosystem, a feral non-native species can essentially change it so severely that the old ecosystem dies completely or mostly, and essentially a new one emerges, often taking many of the original species with it. And there are places in the world where a species exists only in one type of ecosystem and is very fragile. And if that ecosystem goes away, that species goes extinct permanently. That's true of several frogs and many other species, different types of plants, that sort of thing. And there are some examples of this that I don't remember if we get to in here specifically. I think that we do. But there are some plants that like people brought to the United States, for example, because they wanted to have this plant available. And then that plant, it was a domesticated plant, but for some reason it just got out into the wild and it started basically just taking over the other plants that were similar.
Yeah, I mean, kudzu is an example of that. It's a vine that you find in Florida. That will totally choke out forests if you let it grow without controlling it.
That's right. I forgot about the kudzu issue. I remember learning about that when I was down there.
Yeah, it's a whole thing. So I think it's probably worth. We've brought up the term invasive species a couple times. You've heard us say that, and it's worth unpacking kind of what that is and what that looks like, and how in quote unquote invasive species can actually contribute. So, some positives of species entering a new ecosystem, even if they're changing it, we can kind of see it's pretty interesting what they can contribute. So autumn olive, also called Japanese silverberry, which is a really wonderful name.
It
is a bush brought to the U.S. in the 1830s. They thrived easily and spread throughout much of the U.S., outcompeting many other native plant species. And they also provided a new and highly abundant source of food for many indigenous birds and bat populations that specifically the berries that they produce. The birds and bats love these things, and they also bloom earlier in the season compared to more regional berries. So, like, it actually helped improve the current ecosystem and for the species that were living in it.
Yeah, and it did choke off a lot of native plants, and maybe those plants were doing some important things, but it did also make it easier for some of the other native species to do well in those environments. So I've heard people talk about this idea of invasive species and things going feral, and the fact that when they enter an ecosystem, that ecosystem is likely going to change, but there's lots of ways that change can happen. And although some things will suffer, some things will thrive, even things that are not like that were in that ecosystem to begin with. So some feral or invasive species will actually boost the biodiversity of an area in which they enter and help restore habitats that were destroyed for other reasons. Often things like natural disasters or human activity, it might have become an area that was fairly hostile to the native species because of another invasive species, humans. And then introducing a non-native species to that area actually helped, I mean, not restore it necessarily, but change it into a way that it's more hospitable for an ecosystem to exist there rather than being a barren wasteland like Florida.
Right, yeah, like Florida. So like an example of this would be Hawaii, right? So about 67% of Hawaii's native bird species has gone extinct. These birds helped spread seeds of plants that drove the foundation of much of the wildlife, flora, and fauna needed to succeed in that area. But Non-native species that people have intentionally or accidentally released in Hawaii have helped fill the vacancy left by those missing birds. Again, assuming birds are real.
Even cats, for how maligned they are as a feral species, they fill an important niche in many ecosystems. So there's a couple examples I found of this that were really interesting. There was this cat purge campaign on an island in the Indian Ocean called Amsterdam Island. And they were just trying to get rid of all the cats there because there were so many. And what happened when they got rid of the cats is this resulted in a huge boom in the rat and mouse population. The rats and the mice, they tend to be very opportunistic anyway. They just eat and consume whatever's available and find shelter and reproduce and that sort of thing. And they reproduced so prolifically that they started actually killing and eating birds that were around. Like the cats were doing that too, but now the rats are starting to do it. Yeah. And they were causing all sorts of other trouble. And so like having the cats there actually helped keep the balance better in that system, even though the cats weren't native to that area.
Absolutely. And there's other examples of this, like you said, on an island in the Pacific Ocean called Macquarie Island. I'm assuming that's how it is. It looks like it's probably Gaelic. It's got a Gaelic kind of background to it. So everything's probably pronounced real weird.
Yeah.
Anyway, there was a cat purge on this island that resulted in a boom in the rabbit population. And there's an expression, breed like rabbits, because these are prolific breeders. I think there's again, going back to The Simpsons, the sex ed video shows a rabbit family and they end up with 15 babies after the first time they engage. Yeah. So, but the rabbit population grew at a blinding pace and soon destroyed so much vegetation that the other wildlife began to suffer habitat loss. So cats were kind of important for controlling that particular population.
Yeah. So this is some of the things that happened with these invasive species is that they just change things, basically, is what happens. And the change, how we view the change affects how we label the change, whether we call it invasive or we call it contribution or how we decide to label it. So either way, when we change these situations where we find invasive species that have gone in, we often want to try and do something about it. And so there might be this quote unquote solution to invasive species. Obviously, the best solution is prevention. Try to avoid introducing non-native species into habitats where they might outcompete the other flora and fauna in those habitats. But, of course, we can't undo what's already been done. Once established, invasive species are maddeningly difficult to manage, let alone exterminate. There have been some successful campaigns where people have been able to reduce an invasive species population so much. If there's money in it and if there's a will to do it, then some campaigns have been able to do this, but it is really challenging to completely tackle an invasive species.
Right. So, I mean, there are ongoing traditions of trying to manage species through shooting, trapping, fencing, poisoning, all kinds of stuff. Like there's literal hunting seasons around certain species and whatnot to control populations. But what this mostly does is leave less competition for the remaining animals of that species. And they just start having more babies and getting fat and getting happy. And so some other species will fill that gap during that time.
And this is largely a product of non-systematic efforts to try and change a species population numbers. And there's lots of examples of this. So yeah, just as you mentioned, there are places where they have these hunting seasons. There are places that specifically offer rewards for bringing in the carcass of slain animals, or people are just tasked to just go out and just kill them because they know that people will do it. But they try and incentivize, they'll try and say like, hey, for every, I know there was some place where they had a problem, I want to say with a type of rat that was breeding really quickly and eating a lot of people's food. And so they have this program or something like that where they said basically bring in a rat tail, and for every tail you bring in, you'll earn so much money or something, because they were trying to incentivize the people to participate in these culling practices. However, some enterprising people just started breeding that species and then slaughtering them to collect the reward more efficiently.
Right.
It was easier than going out and trying to catch them, so they would just breed them themselves. So that's obviously problematic. But the other problem is that with these unsystematic implementations that just sort of, go out and kill whatever you find and bring back their corpse, is that there is no discernible dent in the invasive species population apart from those small dips that occur periodically. And again, mostly what that does is it just leaves less competition for the ones who are still there. Like they just have more babies, there's more food for them, more shelter for them. It's easier for them to survive. And so then they go right back up to their population limit again.
Right. And just to kind of illustrate how this happens, there was a story about a snake, we think it might be a python, that normally lays around 7 eggs at a time, right? In an environment where people routinely hunted pythons to try to reduce their numbers, one mother was found carrying over 70. So, I mean, you've got this kind of situation where these populations can overbreed, quickly breed, and produce large. I mean, you'd have to have somebody who hunted so many pythons to stop that population from booming. It's one of those things where it's just very likely to happen given the birth rates of some of these species.
Yeah, exactly. In the Galapagos, this is a story many people may have heard because it's been around a lot, but also Radiolab covered it a couple of times. They had a feral goat population. They're most likely deposited there by sailors and pirates. And so they would let these goats out for whatever reason, or they wanted to just have goats on the island so that if they were stopping by on their way to somewhere else, they could maybe have an animal that was sort of like free range livestock. They just grab it and kill it or get its milk or whatever they wanted. Anyway, they were likely deposited there by these naval engagements, whatever they were.
Yeah.
But the goats were very successful on the Galapagos Islands. They have outcompeted many other species, and they consume native plants. They're not particularly specific about the preferences of the plants that they eat, so they'll eat kind of anything. We know this about goats. They're these generalist consumers. The part of the problem that snakes, the pythons, are a problem in Florida is because they're generalists. They'll eat anything. Anybody who's got the sort of flexibility in their diet tends to be more problematic if they're invasive. But anyway, the goats on these islands were really destroying these populations that had evolved there completely separately for centuries or millennia. They'd been there and they were just going away rapidly because the goats were so effectively outcompeting in that ecosystem. So there was the systematic campaign to kill them. I mean, they specifically used something called Judas goats, which is essentially, there's nothing particularly special about them. Basically, what would happen is that goats tend to be fairly social creatures. And so the goats were learning to hide from the people who were there killing all the goats. Mostly they were showing up in helicopters and they just sniper them or machine gun them right out of the plane or the helicopter. The goats learned when sound happens, go hide. And so what they did is they started releasing these goats on the island. They'd watch them go find their friends and then they would slaughter. I think they'd sterilize them so they couldn't breed, but they'd track the goat. It would take it. It would go find its friends. Then they would kill its friends, and then they'll release the goat again. It'd go find its friends. Anyway, they just did this repeatedly, and it was one of the few instances of a successful elimination of an invasive species because they just wiped them out using this culling effort. But it was really targeted and really intensive, and it did work. It did have the effect they wanted it to have.
Right.
I should say.
Right. It's funny that you bring this up. I was just listening to a podcast that was talking about how a lot of like whalers during the 1800s would stop off in the Galapagos Islands and just grab a bunch of tortoises for food.
Yeah.
So like that was like a food source for a lot of sailors, especially when they were whaling, because tortoises didn't have to eat so much, so they didn't have to carry so much grain and stock on the ships to sustain them. Yeah.
So they've also sailors may have wiped out like an entire species of tortoises from the islands. Yeah.
Horrible.
Yeah.
All to make whale candles. So while you go and search Amazon for whale candles, I hope that you don't.
Yeah.
Or maybe look at some conservation efforts. We're going to take a quick break and listen to some ads.
Now, what does all of this have to do with psychology? Well, we kind of have been alluding to it throughout, but one of the things to look at here is that the term feral itself, how we use it and what it means. It's largely a descriptive term that suggests the relative value of the life of another living organism and our relationship to it. So it doesn't necessarily describe anything inherent to the animal's behavior or anything else. It just sort of describes how much that thing means to us where we're at in relation to it.
And something that is typically described as feral is something that scares us. So feral animals represent unpredictability. They represent being undomesticated, right? Which is inherently frightening to many, if not most people. Like, we like order. We like knowing what's coming next. We like being able to approach an animal and not worry about getting bit or getting rabies. Those things are mutually exclusive, but it is one of those things. The term feral is something that scares us. And so we tend to avoid those things.
Whereas a domesticated animal will likely tolerate kind of any general interaction with humans that's not directly painful to them. And even if it is, they often will learn to tolerate it, such as they will train animals to receive medicine or other medical care and that sort of thing. And it might not feel good, but they know that they're generally safe. And so we'll train them to manage that as well. But a feral animal is quote unquote wild for all intents and purposes, and may be aggressive and defensive if approached by humans. And in addition, if you think about just how we're oriented to this, we might feel compelled to feel safe toward an animal that looks familiar. Let's say, for example, a horse. In Nevada,
Sure,
there are a lot of wild and feral horses out there. We see it looks familiar, but we also understand that it may not feel safe toward us. So we see them both as kind of unpredictable and uncertain. We know that on the one hand, horses can be kind and gentle to humans, and we can approach many of them. And these horses look just like those horses, but we don't really know what they're going to do, how they're going to feel about us. So there's this ambiguity there that I think is probably a little bit uncomfortable for many people, and part of why feral feels like it's something unique.
I tend to avoid horses because a horse almost killed me one time.
Were you like playing poker with a horse and you cheated and it got really upset?
It's like, I got real mad. It's like 5 aces, and then kicked me out of the saloon. It was a real rough time. Yeah, I'll share that story another day. It was a wild time. So I'm gonna leave that ambiguity to everybody else. It may have been a feral horse. Who knows? So the point is how do we deal with this idea of feral? Feral doesn't necessarily mean anything fundamental about an animal. It just says a lot more about how people kind of describe things that are uncomfortable or describe things that are out of the quote unquote norm, even though there's quite a lot of feral animals out there. It's just really kind of a more of a human concept more than an animal concept, right? Like it's humans have kind of conceptualized this as a means to classify animals that are annoying or problematic to their convenience and way of life.
Yeah, it says a lot more about the people who use it than the animal that they're using it against. But as we've sort of pointed to, that all being said, there are real world effects that feral and invasive species have on ecosystems. So it is worth understanding our role in adding and removing feral animals from a habitat to which that animal does not naturally belong.
Yeah. So the other side of this is remembering that we are also animals, that we are organisms that live on this planet in these systems, and we consume resources, we avoid predators, we seek shelter, and we proliferate to nearly every type of climate on Earth. We live everywhere but Antarctica, and even then we're trying to figure out ways to do that.
Yeah.
So if we are comparing the effects of a species that spreads and affects the environment, which species has spread the most prolifically, caused record devastation wherever it goes? Humans. Humans are a problem. We are arguably the most invasive species.
Definitely the most damaging species.
Yeah, absolutely.
Far and away, nothing like no disease or insect or mite or fungus holds a candle to the kind of devastation we have wrought on many ecosystems.
Yeah, earlier when I brought up whalers, like literally they were whaling not to eat whales. They were whaling to get oil so they could lubricate machines to like basically move the Industrial Revolution forward.
Fun.
Yeah, whales were used before petroleum was discovered. So that's why whales were hunted mostly.
Well, and then arguably most of these invasive species were due to human activity anyway. So we cause a lot of these problems. Now, many feral species are considered problematic because, as we said, of how they annoy humans. That's like often why we view them as problematic, is because we find them annoying. Feral horses are dangerous for traffic because they're so large and they'll try and cross different roads and stuff like that. Now, for a horse's natural habitat, it's not divided up into you can't cross that big black rocky area, but that it can force them into that situation because the traffic can be really high. And so they'll try and cross it anyway. They'll sort of learn not to as much. But then what that does is that often creates a very shallow genetic diversity in a particular species if they're locked into an area by roads and that sort of thing.
Sure.
Anyway, that is a thing that can happen. But horses also eat a lot, and sometimes they'll get into our crops and gardens, and they do compete with other wildlife too, but they tend to cause relatively little damage in the areas where you find them, and it's mostly a sort of a hindrance to our way of life, our systems, our transportation, and not because they're doing anything else that's really severe.
I saw this really great video. A woman had called in a police report because she had hit a deer and she was mad because they kept putting deer crossings along the road. And they were like, why do you let the deer cross here?
Yeah.
Like, why can't you set up like school? And they were like, that's not what the deer crossing sign is for. And she's like, well, what's a school crossing sign for? It's to let children across. So you put deer crossing signs to let deer across. And it was like a really funny kind of like the operator was like, what are you talking about? What is happening right now? It was great.
Yeah.
So psychology, feral animals, human destruction. There's something that we haven't talked about yet. And I think it's really worth getting into, and that's the idea of feral humans. We have made the comment multiple times that humans are animals. So let's kind of unpack this idea of what a feral human is and how a human even gets to that point.
Yeah. Sometimes humans are also raised away from other humans, and they kind of have to make their way in the world, and they do so without socialization. And we call these also feral humans because they don't sort of grow up around normal human civilization and customs and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and oftentimes you'll hear this term kind of thrown at somebody who maybe has like a lot of problem behavior, and it's an unfortunate term to use for somebody who is really struggling with some. I've heard that described, like somebody described as being feral in the field by other professionals, and it's kind of a bummer.
And some of the examples I found were simply descriptions of unhoused people. So It's like they weren't feral, they just weren't in a house or apartment or anything.
Right, exactly. So fortunately, what we know of the term, the actual definition of feral, is that it's very rare in humans, and there have only been about 100 cases that we're aware of that we can describe as fitting the definition of what feral means.
All right, there's this one story. So I found a whole bunch of stories when looking through this, and I picked out a couple that seemed like they were the most sort of relevant to talk about here. One, they referred to as the real life Mowgli for a very specific reason. But anyway, this person's name was Dina Senachar, or at least that's the name that they gave him. He was a 6-year-old boy that hunters found living in a wolf den in northern India in 1865. So they show up, they're like, well, what's this kid doing here? And they essentially fought the wolves off to take the kid and bring him back to civilization to try and rescue him. And the kid's like, "Rah, rah, rah, rah."
Yeah, super.
In protest.
Yeah, for sure. Now, presumably, he was abandoned, and they brought him to an orphanage where the staff tried to teach him language, how to dress himself, and how to eat from a plate. He mostly walked on all fours. Makes sense. He was raised around wolves.
Yep.
Engaged in guttural grunting sounds and occasionally howled. And after years of working with him, he learned to dress and feed himself, but he never really got the hang of language and always sniffed at his food before eating it, which is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, they said that one of the most human-like habits that he actually did end up picking up was smoking. So there's that.
So weird. Like, think about that. That's like, that was like, okay, like, oh, this kid can't talk. He sniffs his food, but we got him to light a cigarette. That's how we know he's made it.
I wonder how that conversation went about. They're like, why wouldn't he just eat with silverware off of his plate? Let's give him a smoke. That'll calm him down.
Yeah. Honestly, somebody was like, we got to teach him how to be human. We got to teach him all these things. What's the most human thing? Get him a smoker's jacket. Wild.
I like to imagine it was fine cigars that he was really into.
Yeah. I think at the time he probably was smoking cigars. Yeah, that makes more sense.
Unfortunately, he did die of tuberculosis at the ripe old age of 35. His story might sound familiar. As I said, they called him the real Mowgli, and he was the inspiration for the Rudyard Kipling novel, The Jungle Book. And that was this kid's story. Like, he did live in a wolf den with actual wolves. And I did find other stories that had similar depictions of kids who are raised around other canines or other types of animals as well.
All right. So while we take a second to organize the next case, you can hear maybe some advertisements for dog food. I don't know. Now that we've done, I don't know. We'll
coming back with a sad story.
So take a breath. We'll be right back.
Okay, we've been talking about feral humans, and we sort of left you on the edge here of a very sad story of someone who I think they don't meet the definition of feral as we've described it, in that they went and lived in the wilds, but they meet it in sort of a different way. So in 1970, a visually impaired woman and her 13-year-old daughter accidentally walked into a social service office in Los Angeles, California. They were trying to find some other government office or something, but as I said, the woman was visually impaired. accessibility in this country has only recently become a thing.
Right.
And at this time, that was not really a thing. So she found her way into the social services office, and she had a 13-year-old daughter with her.
Right. And so the young girl couldn't speak and didn't seem to understand basic social conventions. And the workers that were there obviously didn't understand the full context, but they could tell that the girl needed some help based on just some of the behavior and the lack of language and all that stuff.
Yeah, so because of how she was behaving, they actually thought she might be autistic. And that was something that they were aware of, that could be, and it's not unreasonable to suspect that was potentially what was going on. They eventually learned that this young 13-year-old girl, she had been severely abused. And for the first 13 years of her life, this girl, whose name was Jeannie, we haven't said that yet, she was locked in a room and had no contact with anyone except her mother or father, and really mostly just her father.
Yeah, she spent most of her time strapped to a chair or locked in a cage and was beaten nearly every day. Her father never even spoke to her, just growled at her. So just the worst kind of situation.
She wasn't able to contact language or be around other people. So it wasn't feral in the sense that it was raised around, non-humans in a wild environment that has no sort of infrastructure, or at least not human infrastructure. But instead that she was raised without being raised. Like she was forced to miss out on the experiences that will allow her to participate meaningfully in those institutions.
Right.
Whatever that might mean, and criticize that however you like, I guess. So anyway, this mother walks in with a 13-year-old girl. They find out that she had been severely neglected, left in this, cage and that sort of thing. And the state pursued charges against the family for child abuse and neglect. And the father died by suicide, leaving a note that said, quote, "The world will never understand." So we really don't know what his motives were. We don't know what he was trying to accomplish or why he did this, or what was going on in that situation. They ended up dropping the lawsuit against the mother, who essentially said she was a victim too, and she couldn't really control the situation. And so that's sort of where it ended up.
That's one of those unfortunate dark corners of humanity.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can move away from that for a second. Now, Jeannie eventually learned to speak, although she did struggle with grammatical conventions. She was also the subject of experimentation for many, many years. Her mother actually eventually put a stop to that, though. So she was able to kind of get out of that situation. And as far as we know today, she's still around and she's living a quiet life, which arguably she deserves.
Yeah, absolutely. Poor thing.
Yeah, it's awful.
Yeah, and you can imagine that although obviously we were at the point where we had ethics boards and stuff, even in the 70s, we had plenty of examples of where scientific experiments, and particularly around psychology, they were doing some pretty shady stuff.
Not particularly kind. I mean, you can look at, there's plenty of government examples too if you look at MK Ultra.
Yeah. So there was that. Fortunately, she seems like she's okay at this point. She would be, in her 70s now, almost?
Yeah, she'd be, if she was 13 in 1970, then she would be, in her 60s. Close to 70.
Okay, in her 60s, yeah. I can do math. There are a lot of other stories of people who were abandoned, lost, or who fled their families or homes, and they survived in the wild during some of their formative developmental years. As we said, it is fairly rare, but it did happen. And many of them, they weren't as severe as these two cases, which is kind of why I wanted to showcase these. And many of these, they had language, they had ways of, they had already been educated in some manner to protect themselves, to survive on their own. But some of them did, live, they essentially left society for one reason or another at a fairly young age. And they would spend 5-6 years out in the wild, living amongst animals or just living on their own.
Yeah.
And that happened, and there was sort of a theme of that in some of the examples. But yeah, some of the most severe examples are the ones that we illustrated here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, that's kind of what we have to say about what it means to be feral. I think one of the big take homes for me is that what feral means is how we describe our relationship to some plant or animal or something, where it is a little bit unpredictable, uncertain, and ambiguous because we have a history of domestication with that living organism. And now it's outside of our domesticated jurisdiction, if you will. And so we call those things feral, but that doesn't mean anything inherent about that organism.
Right. And I think in the case of feral humans, one thing that you run into and one thing that you notice is that many of the behaviors that they pick up, or many of the behaviors they engage in, are typical of the environment they're in, have either been rewarded by social norms created by, let's say, wolves that they were raised by, or punished by, let's say, social norms that are created by an abusive father. So in some cases, the behaviors get shaped up based on in all those cases, behavior gets shaped up based on their environment. However, in those feral cases for humans, that can be very unique and very different based on whichever environment that learner is adapting to.
Yeah, and many of these invasive and feral species, they're very disruptive to the ecosystem in which they find themselves. Now, some of them actually integrate very nicely, and they just kind of boost biodiversity, and it's fine. But a lot of times they'll outcompete. I mean, the thing is, if they don't compete for resources, we don't really hear about it. They just kind of die off, and that's that. Like, nobody would even really be the wiser that species had ever been there, except maybe a small handful of people. And often not even then if they were just an accidental escape or an accidental hitchhiker, if you will. But the ones that do succeed, the reason that we hear about them is because they impact the environment in which they find themselves so severely. They will outcompete other species. They will completely change the overall flora and fauna of an area. They will literally physically change the landscape. We're talking about those pigs in Texas who are like tilling up the soil all over the place. And so their impact can be really intense in how it affects that environment, but also want to consider, as we're talking about with some of those other examples, sometimes that can be, it's just change, and it can ultimately have some kind of positive effect in an environment that they're in. It seems like it's mostly just when it's annoying to humans that they want to step in and do something, but also they will drive many species to extinction if they're left unchecked.
Given all of that, I think the last take-home point I have is that there's no Burma, Florida. So Burmese pythons existing in Burma, Florida doesn't make any sense. They are dangerous. They're scary.
Are you sure? Have you checked that there's no Burma, Florida?
There might be at this point in time. Somebody was probably like, there's so many snakes here, we might as well start a city.
Sure. Snake City.
There's a baseball city, so it's very possible there's a Snake City, Florida.
Yeah. I think all of that, there's always the consideration that we as humans, we have spread and proliferated way more than any other species, and where there have been invasive species, we largely put them there. So just consider, the fact that we have some responsibility here, and maybe people see that as justification for going through and taking extreme measures, and maybe they're right. But I just think it's worth acknowledging that the crux of the problem seems to be us and the things that we do, being reckless or just not careful enough, or what have you, whatever might be the reason that has happened, that we have sort of been the catalyst event that has led to these drastic shifts where we have a species completely take over, or many are killed off, etc. So something there.
And I think the last thing I would say is there is a Snake Creek, Florida.
Hey, there you go.
And it's actually like a half an hour south of where I live.
That's pretty good.
Oh, that's great. That's rich.
That is pretty good. Okay, well, I think that's all that I have to say about being feral and invasive species for right now. Do you have anything else to add before we move to some recommendations?
No, I think that covers it. At the end of the day, it's just a way that we compare ourselves to other things.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, let's transition to some recommendations.
Recommendations.
I am recommending, I'm trying to be not too super specific here, but I'm recommending a social media diet.
Yes.
And mostly what that could mean is cut off your social media interactions completely, but it also could mean just reduce it more than where you're currently at. Like if you're on there 6-12 hours a day, maybe try to go down to like 1 or 2 hours a day. Set a timer for yourself, set a limit for yourself. It's sort of like you could eat an entire gallon of ice cream, but maybe you choose to instead just get out a bowl and put a little bit in that bowl and say when you're done with that bowl, you just won't eat any more ice cream because you don't want to have cavities or be really unhealthy and that sort of thing. And so just a social media diet is what I'm recommending. You might specifically choose which social medias you want to spend the least amount of time on because you're like, you know what? I don't really want to support this racist, alt-right, hate speech, misinformation campaign of violent incel people. So I'm going to maybe not use this little blue thing anymore. I'm going to do something else, whatever
subtle.
That might mean to you. Or join this other platform over here that have that same population. Maybe you choose to just cut them out all completely. But just consider that when you're on social media you are feeding the social media beast. Your engagement with those platforms tells them that their platforms are valuable and that what they're doing is tacitly endorsed by you who chooses to be there. So you might specifically take your time and your money elsewhere as a statement of how you would like to support or not support what is going on at a particular set of those systems. And just consider what your effect is on that. So anyway, the general recommendation is maybe go on a social media diet for as ever long as you feel like that makes sense for you.
I like that. I think that's good. I think it's good.
Thanks.
All right. So my recommendation is an Atlanta-based food joint. It is Black-owned. It is delicious. And it is called the Slutty Vegan.
Nice.
Have you heard of this place?
Not until you sent me a picture, which you want to share your name for your experience here?
So this is our new segment, Why We Chew What We Chew, where we only recommend food things. I was so excited about that.
Yeah, that's really good.
I recently got a chance to go to Atlanta and meet with one of the Why We Do What We Do crew, Jess, who was a friend before the show. And so like it was cool to meet up with her and hang out. And we got to eat at this place called the Slutty Vegan. And it's an entirely vegan restaurant that is just straight up vegan junk food. It's just burgers and fries and stuff like that. But they kind of go with the bent of owning the hoe type of thing.
Got it.
So like, for example, all of the food is there's a sandwich called the Menage a Trois, which is an Impossible Burger,
sure,
vegan bacon and vegan shrimp on the same sandwich. There's the Hollywood Hooker, which is a vegan Philly cheesesteak. There's the One Night Stand. There's the Chicken Ed. There's the Fussy Hussy. I personally got something called the Sloppy Toppy that was really delicious. And so all of it is really, really good. If you like that kind of stuff, it's very like burger, cheese, sauce, like it's messy and it's just really good. And so, I mean, like they don't even like everything, like for example, they have fried pickles with a blackberry mayo sauce they call skinny dippers.
Whoa.
And if you get water, it's just straight up called slutty water. So, it's
sure.
So anyway, my point is go there, have fun, enjoy it. I know there's a little bit of controversy with like one of the sites right now because I guess like some manager was stealing tips from the workers, but like the rest of it,
yikes.
The food itself is good and it's plant-based. So if you like to do that kind of stuff, I think that's cool.
I would love to check that out the next time I'm in Atlanta, or if it makes its way out somewhere to another city where I might find myself, I will definitely look into it. So thank you for the recommendation.
Of course, that's what they're here for.
Well, you mentioned Jess, and that's an important thing because Jess is an important part of our team. And the team of people that help us do the thing that we do, which we appreciate so much, also includes Alan, Patrick, and Justin, and then also you. Thank you for recording with me today, Shane.
Thank you. Thank you.
In addition, we have a group of people who are on social media. If you would like to get early access to our episodes that don't have ads running on them, you still have like the ad segue, but then it just goes immediately into the next, right out of the ad segue. There's not just like blank space. The distributor that we use automatically populates that with ads. But anyway, you get access to that episode and you don't have to listen to the ads. You can join us on Patreon. And you'll also get all kinds of other stuff when you get there. I recently posted a bunch of jokes that I had written, or I hadn't written. I had asked ChatGPT to write for our Spartan notes, and we put up, just fun stuff there. You'd access to our when we record, we cut lots of stuff. We just cut something 1 second ago where I was trying to remember something and couldn't think of it, and Justin's going to cut it out because he's good at that sort of thing, or maybe he won't, just to make me look bad.
Either way, it's fine.
We cut lots of things, but you can get access to the episode with all that stuff left in. You get to see us recording in our home offices that are full of books and guitars and random stuff, and our wild hair that just gets increasingly wild every day, and
feral haircut.
All sorts of fun bonus goodies and stuff. And in addition to that, you get some discounts on merch if you haven't joined us at a high enough level. And there's all sorts of perks. So if you would like to support us, you can go over there. As I mentioned, you can pick up some of our merch. If you don't want to join us on Patreon, just go pick up a water bottle or a beanie or a sweater or something. We've got all kinds of cool swag for sale that you can go pick up, and it really helps us out. And then if you don't want to do either of those things, well, then just tell people about us. And one way you can do that is leaving a rating and review wherever you listen to this. You can just do the 5 stars, just boom, 5 stars. But if you write a review, that also is helpful. But yeah, just tell someone, be like, hey, we have this episode or this podcast I really like to listen to.
Yes,
and you'll like it too. And so you should download it.
Yeah, I like that. I like all of those things.
Great. Otherwise, if you have some experience with feral or invasive species, or you are a feral or invasive species and you want to tell us about it, you should certainly reach out to us. You can also tell us about things like a diet that people should go on that is behavioral and not necessarily nutritional, or restaurants that you like that are kind of like the opposite of a diet, like the Slutty Vegan.
Yes.
And we love hearing all that stuff. You can reach out to us on social media, but you can also email us directly at info@wwd.podcast.com. Those are ways you can support us. Appreciate, honestly, just listening is awesome. So thank you very much for being here, for being a listener.
Yes.
Of course, thank you for the Disseminating Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group and the funding they have provided for us. And the other group of people who have already joined us on Patreon, who help us do our podcast thing, is Amanda, Brad, the Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Kelly, Justine, Kim, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and Stephanie. Thank you all so much for doing what you do.
Yes. You're all so great.
Shane, is there anything else that I forgot or that you'd like to add before we sign off?
Nope, that's it.
Thank you so much for listening. This is Abraham.
Hey, this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.